Let me ask you something. Have you ever trusted someone so deeply, only to watch them shatter that trust right in front of you? Have you ever stayed awake at night, staring at the ceiling, your heart aching as you wondered if maybe you just weren't enough? If you know that heavy, sinking feeling, then listen closely, because this story isn't just about betrayal. It is about what happens when a woman who is broken learns to rise stronger than anyone ever expected. And hey, don't just sit back. Stay with me, because what you are about to hear might touch a part of your heart you thought you had buried forever. And maybe, just maybe, it will remind you of something profoundly powerful, that no matter who tried to break you, you still hold the absolute power to rise. Once, he swore forever as he slid a diamond ring onto her finger. Once, she believed that love was enough to conquer any obstacle, but forever ended in a single night. It was one night with another woman, illuminated under the glittering lights of a city that never sleeps. While he tasted the bitter thrill of betrayal, she carried his unborn child in complete silence, her heart breaking with every single breath she took. Yet, love's ashes can spark something far more dangerous than hatred. They can spark resolve. And when she finally rose pregnant, radiant, and utterly unbroken, the man who betrayed her would finally tremble. The courtroom was never meant to be a theatrical stage. Yet, on that brisk morning in Manhattan, it felt like the world's brightest spotlight had been switched on. The marble floors gleamed like polished ice under the heavy, vaulted ceilings. The mahogany benches were packed shoulder to shoulder with eager reporters, and the air buzzed with frantic whispers so sharp they could practically cut skin. Everyone in that room was waiting for Jonathan Colton, the billionaire real estate tycoon whose sheer arrogance had always filled entire rooms. They waited with bated breath to see his victory dance as he prepared to discard his pregnant wife like yesterday's newspaper. Jonathan had walked in with the insufferable swagger of a man who firmly thought he owned the world. The suit he wore was custom Tom Ford. His cufflinks were pure platinum, and his mistress sat just a few rows back in the gallery, smirking in a crimson dress that clung to her body like sin itself. He had arrogantly promised her that by the end of the hearing, his wife would be gone. His marriage would be dissolved, his assets protected, and she would step into the blinding spotlight as the official woman by his side. But fate had other plans. The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly opened, and silence fell so heavy and absolute that even the judge froze mid-sentence. All heads turned, and there she was. Isabella Colton stood in the doorway, heavily pregnant and breathtakingly radiant despite her months of suffering, walking slowly but firmly down the center aisle. Her bespoke silk maternity dress hugged her figure beautifully. Her dark eyes were steady, and her chin was held high. But the true shock was that she was not alone. On her arm stood William Blackwell. He was the William Blackwell, the billionaire CEO, the man whose very name carried the crushing weight of global empires, the one titan of industry nobody, in their right mind, ever dared to cross. He wasn't just a father, he was an impenetrable fortress. And in that exact moment, Jonathan's smug smirk vanished, entirely as all the color drained from his handsome face. His mistress, Cassandra, shifted highly uncomfortably in her wooden seat. The photographers, gathered in the back of the room, nearly broke their expensive cameras trying to capture the historic scene unfolding before them. Jonathan had spent the previous night in another woman's bed, laughing loudly, drinking vintage champagne, and feeling entirely untouchable. But today, inside this quiet courtroom, he was no longer the apex hunter. He was the prey. The whispers began like a dark storm gathering on the horizon. Is that her? Father? Oh my God. That's William Blackwell. She's pregnant. Look at her belly. He's done. Colton is completely done. Jonathan tried desperately to stand tall, but his own hands betrayed his panic. Clenching into tight fists, loosening, and then clenching again. The judge cleared her throat, but even she could not completely hide her utter shock. The power dynamics of the entire city had shifted in an instant, because this wasn't just a standard high society divorce hearing anymore. It was a reckoning. Isabella walked with a slow, deliberate grace, as though each measured step echoed with the years of betrayal and the countless nights of silent tears she had endured. The woman Jonathan genuinely thought was weak, fragile, and easily broken was now a terrifying force of nature he couldn't possibly control. And beside her, William Blackwell radiated a dark, lethal authority, looking exactly like a storm cloud about to break open and flood the earth. His icy blue eyes swept the room with disgust, and even the armed bailiffs seemed to stand a little straighter under his gaze. Jonathan's mistress, Cassandra, nervously bit her red lip, suddenly realizing that her coveted place in the billionaire's empire was not nearly as secure as she had once foolishly believed. She fiddled anxiously with her heavy diamond bracelet, the very one Jonathan had given her just last week, and wondered silently if it would mean anything at all once this trial was over. Jonathan swallowed hard, a lump of dread forming in his throat. He desperately wanted to sneer, to throw a cutting insult across the aisle, to somehow reclaim control of the narrative. But for the very first time in his arrogant life, words completely failed him. The judge spoke again, her tone significantly sharper now, pulling the stunned courtroom back to order. Mrs. Colton, she said, her voice calm but carrying immense authority. You are here today to respond to the petition filed by your husband. Do you wish to proceed with your own legal counsel? Isabella's lips curved, not into a warm smile, but into something far more dangerous, pure resolve. She didn't look at Jonathan. She didn't even cast a passing glance at Cassandra. Her steely gaze was fixed directly on the judge as she answered with a steady, unwavering voice that carried to every single corner. of the vast room. Yes, Your Honor. You do. And I have my father, William Blackwell, as my representative today. The collective gasp that followed her statement literally rattled the antique. Chandeliers above. A billionaire's wife, secretly backed by a billionaire father, whose wealth dwarfed her husband's. The ravenous press would feast on this spectacular drama for weeks. Jonathan's jaw tightened painfully, his chest rising and falling in shallow panic bursts. He absolutely hadn't expected this. He truly thought Isabella would come to court alone, meek, trembling, and completely ready to sign whatever unfair papers his aggressive lawyers shoved in front of her. He thought she was still the naive girl who cried quietly into her silk pillow while he slipped out into the night to attend fake late business meetings. He thought she was still the desperate woman who begged him to come home, who clung to blind hope even when the intoxicating perfume on his tailored suits wasn't hers. But the incredible woman standing before him now was completely different. She was stronger, unshakable, and entirely unafraid. And the innocent child she carried safely inside her belly only made her more untouchable. Jonathan glanced around the room, a sickening realization washing over him. The eyes of the world were no longer fixed on him with admiration and envy. They were glued to Isabella, and every camera lens, every scratching pen, every hushed whisper was actively rewriting the story of his life. He was no longer the victorious, self-made billionaire genius. He was the betrayer, the ultimate coward, the foolish man who was about to be utterly crushed by the very woman he had so deeply underestimated. And then Isabella turned her head just slightly, her dark eyes finally locking with his. There was no hot anger in her gaze, nor was there any lingering sorrow. It was simply a promise. It was a silent, lethal promise that this fierce battle had only just begun, and that Jonathan Colton's sprawling empire, his massive pride, his shiny mistress, and his web of lies, absolutely everything, would very soon crumble before the watching world. And Jonathan realized far too late that he had never truly known the woman he had married. Long before the cameras flashed in that Manhattan court, Isabella Colton had been just a girl who dreamed of genuine love, not scandalous headlines. To the outside world, she looked fragile, almost ordinary in her quiet grace. But those who took the time to look closer saw something else entirely, a bright inner fire, and a quiet, unyielding dignity that absolutely no amount of betrayal could ever extinguish. At 28 years old, Isabella carried both the beautiful, radiant glow of pregnancy and the dark, heavy shadows of profound pain. Her soft chestnut hair framed a beautiful face that had once been constantly lit with joyous laughter. But the relentless trauma of the last year had slowly carved it into something much more solemn, more hauntingly beautiful. She wasn't the type of woman to eagerly chase luxury, even though her entire life had been surrounded by it. She was the only daughter of William Blackwell, one of the most powerful and feared CEOs in all of New York. But she had deliberately hidden that intimidating truth. When she fell in love, she desperately wanted to be seen as herself, to be loved for her own heart, and not viewed merely as a billionaire's trust fund daughter. And when she first met Jonathan Colton, she genuinely thought she had found exactly that, someone who saw her purely as Isabella, not as the Blackwell heiress. Isabella had studied interior design in college, a deep passion she had carried since she was a young child, spending hours sketching sprawling dream houses in the margins of her school notebooks. After graduating, she had deliberately taken a modest, low-profile job at a boutique design studio in Manhattan. She absolutely didn't flaunt her elite family connections. She didn't drive flashy luxury cars, and she didn't wear recognizable designer clothes unless they were birthday gifts from her father. She simply wanted normalcy. She wanted peace, and a life she could proudly call her own. Jonathan had swept into her quiet, curated world like a massive storm she couldn't possibly resist. He was slightly older, fiercely confident, wildly ambitious, and exactly the kind of charismatic man who could make an entire room bend around his sheer presence. At first, she innocently thought his overwhelming confidence was a form of protection. He made her feel deeply chosen, uniquely special, and thoroughly adored. Their whirlwind romance rapidly turned into a lavish marriage within a year, and Isabella truly believed she had found her perfect happily ever after. For a while, it felt incredibly true. Jonathan spoiled her with massive bouquets of exotic flowers, whispered beautiful promises into the dark, and engaged in endless, passionate talk of the grand empire they would build together as partners. He gently brushed her hair behind her ears at night, lovingly rubbed her aching feet when she was tired from the design studio, and kissed her forehead exactly like she was the most precious thing in the entire world. Isabella frequently told herself that she was the absolute luckiest woman alive. But a love built on selfish illusions never lasts. Slowly, the dark cracks appeared in the foundation. Jonathan became increasingly busy, growing hungrier for absolute power, and acting highly restless in their quiet home. He stayed out incredibly late, quickly dismissing her genuine worries with sharp, biting words. He traveled more frequently, always effortlessly explaining his prolonged absences away as vital corporate business, the cheap perfume lingering heavily on his suits, the faint red lipstick stains on his white collars, the hollow, rehearsed excuses. They all became terrifying shadows that she tried desperately to ignore in order to save her marriage. When she found out she was pregnant, Isabella's bruised heart had soared with renewed hope. She firmly believed the baby would magically change absolutely everything. She thought that Jonathan would finally come back to her, that his ambition would soften into fatherhood, and that love would ultimately win the day. She spent countless lonely nights decorating the nursery by herself, carefully painting the walls in soothing pastel tones, lovingly folding tiny cotton onesies into wooden drawers, and happily imagining the perfect family they would soon become. But Jonathan only grew colder. The man who had once brought her dozens of red roses began cruelly mocking her for looking constantly tired. The man who had once proudly held her hand in public stopped touching her altogether, pulling away as if her presence was a burden. And then, one terrible night, the ultimate illusion was shattered. She saw him, arm in arm with Cassandra Monroe, his glamorous mistress, at a highly publicized charity gala that he had explicitly promised her was strictly a boring business obligation. Her entire world shattered into a million jagged pieces. Isabella wept quietly that night, curled into a ball on the cold floor, holding her belly and whispering endless, tearful apologies to the innocent life growing inside her. She felt utterly weak, completely discarded, and entirely invisible. But she wasn't alone, because her father, William Blackwell, had been quietly watching the tragedy unfold from the shadows. Though they had been somewhat estranged for years due to her desire for fierce independence, he intimately knew his daughter's pain and the agonizing sight of his only child being publicly humiliated and so callously betrayed lit a terrifying, unquenchable fury inside his chest. He was a man widely known for ruthlessly crushing his corporate rivals in boardrooms, for building massive global empires out of stone, steel, and strategy. But when it came to Isabella, he was a fiercely protective father first. When Isabella finally gathered the courage to visit his office and confess absolutely everything, the endless lies, the younger mistress, the crushing loneliness, William didn't hesitate for a single second. He didn't scold her for stubbornly hiding her true background from her husband. He didn't tell her she was foolish for falling blindly in love with a social climber. He simply walked around his massive desk, took her trembling hands in his own, looked her directly in the eye, and said, "You don't have to fight this alone anymore." For the very first time in agonizing months, Isabella felt a spark of genuine hope. Her pregnancy had made her physical body heavy and exhausted, but it had also made her maternal spirit incredibly strong. Every single kick from the growing baby reminded her that she wasn't just fighting for her own wounded pride, she was fiercely fighting for her child's entire future. And with her billionaire father firmly by her side, she quickly realized she had significantly more power at her fingertips than Jonathan could ever possibly imagine. The profound transformation began quietly. Isabella no longer cried herself to sleep into her silk pillow. She no longer sent desperate text messages begging Jonathan for scraps of attention. Instead, she began to meticulously plan. With cold, calculated precision, she documented absolutely every single betrayal. She saved every suspicious message, downloaded every scandalous tabloid photo, and tracked the marital funds he was siphoning. She leaned heavily on her father's elite legal team, a group of attorneys considered the most ruthless and brilliant in all of Manhattan. She prepared herself for an all-out war, not with hysterical screams or bitter tears, but with a calm, deliberate, and icy resolve. Still, late at night when she lay alone in the massive, empty bed, she sometimes remembered the sweet, naive girl she used to be. The girl who deeply believed in fairy tales, who truly thought that pure love could conquer absolutely any obstacle. That innocent girl was entirely gone now. In her place stood a formidable woman forged in the fires of betrayal, carrying new life inside her, and entirely backed by an unstoppable empire. And yet, despite absolutely everything he had put her through, Isabella's heart had not turned to cold stone. She still possessed an immense capacity to love. Not Jonathan. Not anymore. The love she had for him had been burned to ash. But she loved her unborn child fiercely, with a primal, maternal devotion that made her completely unstoppable. She deeply loved the warm memory of her late mother, who had once sat her down and told her, "Strength doesn't always roar, Isabella. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it walks into a room very quietly and completely changes everything." She was finally ready to change absolutely everything. The day of the court hearing, Isabella rose early before the sun had even touched the city skyline. She stood silently before the full-length mirror, placing one gentle hand on her swollen belly and using the other to brush away the absolute last tears she would ever, in her entire life, shed for Jonathan Colton. She wore a beautifully tailored, pale blue dress that glowed softly against her skin. It was deliberately chosen not for high fashion, but for absolute dignity. She desperately wanted the entire world to see her exactly as she was: a fiercely protective mother, a relentless fighter, and a woman who would absolutely not be silenced or shamed. When William Blackwell arrived at the penthouse to personally escort her to the courthouse, she felt a massive surge of courage she hadn't known she still possessed. His imposing presence was not just a shield of physical protection. It was a loud, undeniable declaration of war. The entire world would finally see that she was absolutely not abandoned, not weak, and definitely not broken. She walked into the grand courthouse not as Jonathan's pathetic, discarded wife, not as a weeping victim, but as Isabella Blackwell Colton, daughter of immense power, mother of profound strength, and a woman of unbreakable resilience. And when Jonathan finally saw her, flanked by the very titan he had so foolishly underestimated, she knew deep in her healing heart that the tables had finally, permanently turned. Because the sweet, submissive Isabella he had so casually betrayed was entirely gone. In her place was someone he could absolutely never defeat, and the epic war for her dignity was only just beginning. The glamorous world Isabella had unknowingly married into was incredibly dazzling on its shiny surface, but lurking just beneath the gold leaf and glitter was a toxic darkness she had never expected. It was a cutthroat world of Massive chandeliers and endless vintage champagne. Of sprawling penthouses with breathtaking views that touched the sky. And of opulent gala halls where social power was traded exactly like cold currency. To naive outsiders, it seemed exactly like an elite paradise. To Isabella, it had slowly, suffocatingly become a gilded cage. The massive Colton estate sat prominently on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. A sprawling, historic mansion that looked significantly more like a royal palace than a functioning home. Pristine white limestone walls stretched impossibly high above a perfectly manicured row of sycamore trees, and the heavy, wrought iron security gates gleamed brightly under golden floodlights. Inside, absolutely everything screamed of unimaginable wealth. There was the sweeping, dramatic staircase carved from imported Italian marble, the expansive gallery. Walls lined with priceless original paintings Jonathan had aggressively collected at Sotheby's auctions, the formal dining room featuring a custom mahogany table long enough to easily seat 30 guests. But material wealth absolutely does not equal emotional warmth. To Isabella, the grand, echoing halls constantly felt freezing cold. Every single crystal chandelier sparkled brilliantly, but absolutely none of their bright light ever reached her lonely heart. She fondly remembered the very early days of their marriage when simply walking through those massive front doors made her feel exactly like she was stepping into a beautiful fairy tale. But as the lonely months dragged on, that fragile fairy tale crumbled into dust. Jonathan's booming laughter echoed less and less in the cavernous halls. His rapid footsteps grew increasingly distant, and when he did finally appear at home, it was almost always in a frantic rush, barking angry phone calls into the air regarding stock prices, or completely brushing past her in the foyer with a distracted, unfeeling kiss on the cheek. The sprawling penthouse office was his true, undisputed kingdom. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows perfectly overlooked the lush greenery of Central Park, the iconic city skyline stretching endlessly in every direction. It was in that exact room that Jonathan aggressively met with wealthy investors, smoothly charmed reluctant board members, and ruthlessly planned the next corporate acquisition that would massively expand his real estate empire. Tragically, it was also exactly there that Isabella first noticed the glaring, undeniable signs of his betrayal. She found bright red lipstick stubbornly clinging to crystal Scotch glasses after his late business meetings. She smelled heavy, floral designer perfume lingering sickeningly in the stale air of the office. She eventually found a highly secured second cell phone cleverly hidden in the false bottom of his desk drawer. But the specific setting that revealed the ugly truth most brutally wasn't even inside the walls of their unhappy home. It was the gala. The Bright Futures Charity Gala was universally considered the absolute crown jewel of Manhattan's elite social calendar. Every single year, hundreds of the city's wealthiest, most powerful figures gathered beneath the massive crystal chandeliers at the legendary Grand Metropolitan Hotel. The sprawling ballroom always glittered blindingly with thousands of sequins and millions of dollars in borrowed diamonds. Every single guest dressed exactly like modern royalty. Highly trained waiters in crisp white gloves floated effortlessly across the polished dance floor carrying heavy silver trays of champagne. While a world-class live orchestra filled the massive room with classical music as smooth as velvet. It was exactly here, amid the blinding dazzle of New York's absolute elite, that Jonathan Colton decided to brazenly flaunt his mistress to the world. Isabella had quietly chosen not to attend the gala that particular year. At 6 months pregnant, she felt incredibly exhausted, nauseous, and highly uncomfortable in her own changing skin. And Jonathan had smoothly, convincingly, assured her it was fine. It's just boring corporate business, darling. My biggest investors absolutely expect me to show my face. You should just rest. Here at home. You and the baby really need it. She desperately believed him. Or perhaps, deep down in her soul, she just desperately wanted to believe him to save her own sanity. But when the glossy photos hit the vicious tabloids and gossip blogs the very next morning, her entire world tilted sickeningly off its axis. There he was, looking incredibly handsome in a sharp black tuxedo, his arm wrapped tightly and possessively around the bare waist of Cassandra Monroe, the young, striking woman, whose lingering presence had already haunted Isabella's sleepless nights. Cassandra wore a daring scarlet gown cut shockingly low, her manicured hand resting intimately and possessively flat on Jonathan's chest, acting exactly as though she had already fully claimed him as her own property. The screaming headline burned itself permanently into Isabella's memory. Billionaire Jonathan Colton stuns at gala with mysterious beauty. Where was his pregnant wife? The massive betrayal wasn't just being whispered about in dark shadows anymore. It was highly public, brazenly flaunted under bright chandeliers and exploding camera flashes. Jonathan had actively chosen the most high-profile gala of the year, the very beating heart of their exclusive social circle, to completely humiliate her. And the entire world eagerly noticed. The powerful Blackwell family had always lived adjacent to this glittering, superficial world. But William Blackwell rarely indulged in such flashy, meaningless displays of wealth. To him, real money wasn't meant for buying cheap champagne and crystal chandeliers to impress strangers. It was meant for aggressively building unshakable global empires. But when he saw those scandalous tabloid photos of his son-in-law, a burning rage, unlike any he had ever felt in a boardroom battle, coursed violently through his veins. His beloved daughter had been cruelly paraded as a pathetic ghost, her physical absence openly mocked, and her basic dignity entirely stripped away in front of the very people who had once shaken her hand with fake respect. Meanwhile, completely oblivious to the impending danger, Jonathan happily basked in the toxic media attention. The gala had been his personal stage, and he had narcissistically relished every single second of it. Cassandra had laughed loudly at all his mediocre jokes, whispered intimately in his ear, and boldly kissed his cheek while dozens of photographers clicked away furiously. The wealthy investors had simply smirked, some highly amused by his audacity, some mildly scandalized, but Jonathan arrogantly thought himself completely untouchable. He genuinely thought the massive empire he had built, the billions sitting in his bank accounts, gave him the absolute right to casually discard his pregnant wife exactly like a forgotten, out-of-season accessory. But he hadn't counted on the massive, destructive storm that was quietly building in the shadows. For Isabella, the intense public humiliation cut significantly deeper than anything she had ever experienced before. She sat entirely alone in her massive, dark bedroom that night, the beautiful, half-finished nursery waiting silently. Just down the hall, staring blankly out at the glowing, indifferent city skyline. Outside her window, she felt completely trapped, surrounded by a glittering, wealthy world that fundamentally wasn't hers, suffocated by the very same beautiful chandeliers that now seemed to actively mock her pain. She had deeply, truly loved Jonathan in that exact same hotel ballroom once, at an earlier gala, years ago, when he had tightly held her hand and romantically whispered that she was the absolute only woman in the room who mattered. And now, that beautiful memory twisted violently in her gut like a rusted knife. The main settings of their lives together, the sprawling penthouse, the glittering galas, the cold courtrooms, were all part of a grand theater of power. It was an environment specifically designed to make ruthless men like Jonathan feel invincible and unaccountable. But Isabella knew a profound secret that Jonathan didn't. She knew that even the grandest, most beautiful ballroom could instantly become a bloody battlefield, and she was absolutely no longer afraid of stepping out of the shadows and into the blinding light. The highly anticipated court hearing was officially scheduled at the historic New York Supreme Courthouse, an austere, imposing granite building featuring massive Corinthian columns and a dark history of legal drama significantly older than Jonathan's new fortune. The worn marble steps leading up to the entrance had seen legendary kings of finance brought weeping to their knees, and its high walls had heard the loud echoes of massive scandals that had once violently shook the entire city. And now, it would proudly host the epic, spectacular downfall of Jonathan Colton. On the freezing morning of the hearing, the grand courthouse itself became the main stage of the drama. Hundreds of hungry reporters gathered aggressively on the stone steps, their cameras flashing nonstop, their microphones held high and ready. The ugly whispers of the billionaire's betrayal had successfully reached absolutely every corner of Manhattan, and everyone desperately wanted to witness the final showdown in person. Was the discarded wife truly as broken as the tabloids claimed? Would the arrogant Jonathan simply walk free with his beautiful mistress grinning at his side? Or would something else entirely, something vastly bigger and more explosive, finally unfold? Inside the massive building, the atmosphere was incredibly thick with palpable anticipation. The high, vaulted ceiling arched above the room exactly like a solemn cathedral. Pale winter sunlight streamed brightly through the tall Arched windows, casting long, dramatic shadows entirely across the silent room. The heavy wooden gallery benches creaked loudly as the city's elite, journalists, and lawyers quickly settled in, all completely ready to watch the legal drama of the year unfold. Even the stale air inside smelled heavily. Charged, a potent mix of old paper, polished leather, and raw human nerves. And it was exactly there, inside that hallowed, echoing courtroom, that the stark contrast of their two vastly different worlds violently collided. Jonathan's blinding, toxic arrogance crashed head-on against Isabella's quiet, unshakable strength. His flashy mistress's cheap smirk was pitted directly against the steady, terrifying hand of William Blackwell. The fake, glamorous illusions of galas and penthouses were finally forced to face the raw, unforgiving truth of the justice system. This specific setting wasn't just the passive backdrop of their tragic story. It was the ultimate battlefield where absolutely every crystal chandelier, every marble pillar, and every flashing camera would bear silent witness to a brutal war of betrayal and ultimate redemption. And when the pregnant Isabella confidently entered that courthouse with her Titan father firmly at her side, the exact same glittering world that had once mocked her tears instantly became her grand stage of absolute triumph. Because the very same public setting Jonathan had so cruelly used to humiliate her would now serve as the exact place where he publicly lost absolutely everything he held dear. Jonathan Colton was exactly the kind of highly narcissistic man who firmly believed the entire world owed him absolutely everything he desired. Born into a life of nothing, he had aggressively and ruthlessly clawed his way up the steep corporate ladder, utilizing weaponized charm, pure ruthlessness, and a highly practiced smile that could easily mask the daggers he held behind his back. By the relatively young age of 35, he had miraculously transformed himself into one of Manhattan's wealthiest, most talked about billionaires. His handsome face was constantly splashed across the glossy covers of financial magazines that shamelessly celebrated extreme wealth as though it were divine royalty. To his wealthy, greedy investors, Jonathan was considered an absolute visionary. To his overworked, terrified employees, he was a demanding, unpleasable tyrant. To Isabella, he had once been a loving, devoted husband. But in objective truth, he was simply a deeply broken man who could never, ever be truly satisfied, not with massive financial success, not with unchecked corporate power, and certainly not even with pure, unconditional love. His flashy mistress, Cassandra Monroe, was the absolute perfect, superficial reflection of that endless, greedy hunger. At 26 years old, she was exactly everything that Isabella wasn't. Or, at least, that was exactly how Jonathan cruelly framed the comparison in his own twisted mind. Cassandra was incredibly bold, where Isabella was soft and gentle. She was obnoxiously loud and demanding, where Isabella was peaceful and quiet. She was entirely unashamed of her greed, where Isabella was incredibly modest and graceful. Cassandra absolutely thrived in the blinding spotlight, greedily feeding on male attention. Exactly like it was oxygen to her lungs. To Jonathan, she wasn't just a passionate lover. She was a shiny, walking accessory completely dedicated to stroking his massive ego, a physical trophy that aggressively screamed to the entire world, I am so powerful I can have absolutely whatever I want, regardless of the consequences. The two toxic lovers had first met at a massive corporate networking event. Almost a full year earlier, Cassandra had been working as a high-end marketing consultant specifically hired to promote the gala. Her striking, fiery red hair and her loud, daring laugh had instantly caught Jonathan's predatory attention. From all the way across the crowded room, she absolutely wasn't shy. Not in the sweet, endearing way Isabella had been when he first met her at the art studio. Cassandra didn't blush prettily or stumble nervously over her words. She boldly locked eyes with Jonathan across the room exactly as if she already completely owned him, acting exactly as if she knew precisely how incredibly powerful her manufactured beauty could be over weak men. That exact night, Jonathan didn't bother going home to his loyal wife. He went straight to Cassandra's hotel room. At first, the illicit affair was highly discreet and carefully managed. There were hidden candlelit dinners in private rooms, stolen romantic weekends out of state, and hushed, whispered phone calls taken in the bathroom while Isabella slept peacefully in the very next room. But over time, Jonathan's massive ego grew increasingly, dangerously reckless. The intense secrecy of the affair slowly became a massive thrill to him, and that dark thrill quickly morphed into blinding arrogance. Soon, he wasn't just quietly sneaking around in the shadows anymore. He was actively, proudly flaunting Cassandra to his peers. He brazenly brought her to high-level business meetings, poorly disguised as a junior associate. He let her intimately pick out his expensive silk ties for him before making major public television appearances. And eventually, his arrogance peaked when he boldly took her to the Bright Futures Gala, proudly parading her under the bright chandeliers while the paparazzi cameras flashed all around them. It was absolutely not true love. It was pure, unadulterated power play. Jonathan deeply, sickeningly loved the exact way people looked at him with shock when the stunning Cassandra was hanging on his arm. He fed off the palpable envy in other men's eyes, and he relished the frantic, scandalized whispers of the women hiding behind their hands. To him, the entire spectacle was highly intoxicating. Yes, he had a sweet, pregnant wife sitting alone at home, but he also had a gorgeous mistress who openly worshipped the ground he walked on in public. To his twisted mind, it was the absolute, ultimate proof of his total masculine dominance. He firmly believed he could successfully have it all. He could deeply humiliate Isabella on a global scale and still walk confidently into any corporate boardroom in the city exactly like an untouchable king. And Cassandra eagerly encouraged his worst, most destructive impulses. She constantly fed his massive pride, wrapping her arms around him and whispering highly toxic poison directly into his willing ear. She just looks so incredibly weak and pathetic without you standing next to her, Cassandra once said with a nasty smirk, casually tossing a tabloid photo of a sad-looking Isabella onto the bed. You are the real shining star here, Jonathan. You absolutely deserve someone who shines just as brightly with you in public, not some boring housewife who constantly hides in the shadows. Jonathan foolishly lapped up the flattery like a dying man finding water. He quickly began to view the loyal Isabella not as the incredible woman he had once deeply loved, but as a heavy, annoying burden. To him, she had become too quiet, completely unglamorous, frustratingly pregnant, and highly inconvenient to his new lifestyle. In his mind, she was the heavy anchor dragging him down to the ocean floor, while Cassandra was the blazing fire lifting him higher into the sky. But what Jonathan's blinding arrogance prevented him from realizing was that his actions were rapidly turning him into a massive, highly unprofessional spectacle. The exact same wealthy investors and peers who smiled at him politely in public were aggressively whispering about his lack of judgment in private. They absolutely noticed the overly intimate way he touched Cassandra's bare back at formal dinners. They noticed the highly unprofessional way his eyes lingered on her body during serious board meetings. And they definitely noticed the glaring way his pregnant wife was conspicuously absent from absolutely every single major corporate event. Manhattan's elite society absolutely loved a juicy sakangdan, and Jonathan was currently feeding them a massive, multi-course feast. Behind heavily closed doors in the penthouse, Jonathan was even crueler to his wife. He openly, maliciously mocked Isabella's comfortable maternity clothes, sneered at her for naturally gaining baby weight, and dramatically rolled his eyes whenever she softly asked him to please be home in time for important doctor's appointments. You're just being highly emotional and irrational, he would say dismissively, waving his hand at her tears. The pregnancy hormones are just making you act completely crazy. Leave me alone. He absolutely didn't see her valid tears as an expression of deep pain. He solely saw them as a pathetic display of weakness. And Cassandra was absolutely always there in the background, ready to maliciously reinforce the cruelty. She actively taunted Isabella indirectly through highly curated social media posts. She posted cryptic, gloating captions, uploaded intimate photos of her and Jonathan drinking in his penthouse office, and made subtle, inside joke digs that she knew only Isabella would recognize and understand. To Cassandra, the affair wasn't just about finding love or satisfying lust. It was entirely about securing a massive victory. She desperately wanted to completely replace Isabella, to entirely erase her existence, and to proudly wear the coveted title of Mrs. Colton as a shiny, golden badge of absolute conquest. The villainy of Jonathan and Cassandra wasn't hidden in the dark shadows, it was proudly displayed to the world exactly like expensive jewelry. They absolutely thrived in their shared arrogance, entirely convinced that the pregnant Isabella was completely powerless, and that her continued silence simply meant she had fully surrendered to their abuse. Jonathan firmly believed his billions of dollars could easily buy him total freedom from any legal or social consequences, fully expecting that his massive name and political influence could easily erase any lingering scandal. Cassandra firmly believed her fleeting youth and manufactured beauty were absolutely enough to permanently secure her a golden throne right at his side. But villains almost always forget one crucial, fatal thing: extreme arrogance completely blinds you to reality. Jonathan entirely underestimated Isabella. He foolishly saw her quiet, gentle nature as inherent fragility, failing to recognize it as immense inner strength. He arrogantly thought her tears meant she was completely broken, never once realizing that she was actually quietly gathering her emotional strength for a massive battle. He fatally mistook her deep silence for absolute surrender, never once realizing it was a highly calculated strategy. And Cassandra, looking so incredibly smug in her stolen, bright spotlight, never in a million years imagined that the quiet woman she relentlessly mocked online would soon walk confidently into a federal courtroom wielding a financial power far, far greater than Jonathan's billions. Jonathan's ultimate, spectacular downfall actually began the very night before the highly anticipated court hearing, though he was far too drunk and arrogant to know it. He had spent the entire evening partying heavily with Cassandra at a massive penthouse suite downtown, shamelessly indulging in endless vintage champagne and loud, arrogant laughter, loudly boasting to her about how tomorrow's quick hearing would finally rid him of his annoying wife forever. She's completely terrified of me. She'll sign the divorce papers without putting up a single fight, he bragged loudly, sloppily kissing Cassandra's neck as she poured him another drink. And then, absolutely nothing will ever stop us from taking over the city. But fate, it turns out, has an incredibly cruel, ironic sense of timing. As Jonathan eventually passed out and slept off his massive indulgence in another woman's bed, Isabella was wide awake, meticulously preparing her grand entrance. With her father, William Blackwell, she absolutely wasn't coming to court to sign away her hard-earned dignity. She was coming to aggressively reclaim it. And Jonathan, the arrogant villain who thought himself entirely untouchable by the laws of men, would very soon stand trembling in a courtroom completely stripped of all his corporate power, watching his mistress's smug smirk fade into terror, and feeling his entire empire violently trembling beneath his feet. Because arrogant villains may easily win the initial small battles, but in the bitter end, their hubris always writes the script for their own absolute destruction. And Jonathan Colton was about to discover, in the most painful way possible, that the quiet woman he so callously betrayed was absolutely no helpless victim. She was a Category 5 storm that he could never, ever hope to control. It all began with quiet, hushed whispers, but the scandal absolutely didn't stay That way for very long. Manhattan high society thrives on juicy scandal the exact same way a living body thrives on oxygen. And Jonathan Colton had carelessly handed the city a scandal far too delicious for them to ignore. The initial, shocking gala photographs had been only the very beginning of the nightmare. Soon, the massive betrayal wasn't just a nasty rumor safely tucked away in the back pages of society columns. It was the screaming, bold font headlines splashed across every single glossy magazine in the checkout aisles. And it was the primary topic whispered through every single elite cocktail party. On the Upper East Side, billionaire Jonathan Colton seen getting cozy with red-haired beauty at gala. Pregnant wife mysteriously absent. That one devastating headline had been more than enough to instantly ignite the fire of public scrutiny. But the relentless barrage of paparazzi photos that rapidly followed poured gallons of gasoline directly onto the flames. Jonathan and Cassandra were aggressively spotted dining at the most exclusive restaurants, carelessly slipping into five-star boutique hotels, and happily strolling hand-in-hand down Fifth Avenue exactly as though they were completely invincible to public opinion. The invasive paparazzi lenses successfully captured every single arrogant smirk, every stolen, passionate kiss, and every cruel, highly public reminder that Isabella, now 6 months pregnant and incredibly vulnerable, was absolutely nowhere in sight. For Isabella, sitting alone in her apartment, the betrayal wasn't just a deeply personal heartbreak anymore. Her marriage was now public property, dissected by strangers. She could no longer even walk into a quiet neighborhood cafe to get tea without intensely feeling a dozen judging eyes burning into her back. She could no longer casually flip through a lifestyle magazine without unexpectedly seeing Cassandra's smug, heavily contoured face smiling mockingly back at her. From the glossy pages, even the friendly doorman at her luxury building, who had once been so warm and incredibly polite, now looked at her with an expression of deep, sickening pity in his eyes. That was honestly the absolute worst part of the entire ordeal. It wasn't just the vicious whispers of betrayal, or even the intense public humiliation of her husband's highly visible affair. It was the suffocating pity. People looked at her exactly as though she were made of incredibly fragile, cracked glass that was just about to violently shatter into a million pieces right in front of them. One particularly difficult afternoon, Isabella had bravely ventured out into a high-end designer boutique on Madison Avenue, fiercely determined to buy herself a beautiful maternity dress that would hopefully make her feel beautiful and human again, if only for a fleeting moment, as she slowly slipped into a stunning, pale lavender silk gown in the fitting room. The sales associate's cell phone, resting on the nearby counter, suddenly buzzed loudly with a breaking news notification. Isabella honestly didn't mean to look, but her eyes caught the glowing screen. And the high-definition image displayed there was absolutely unmistakable. It was Jonathan, his large hand resting highly possessively on Cassandra's bare waist, leaving an exclusive downtown restaurant late the night before. The trashy, sensationalized caption read, "True love in the city. Billionaire." Jonathan Colton absolutely can't hide his burning passion for his stunning new flame. Isabella completely froze, staring blankly at her own reflection in the fitting room mirror. The beautiful lavender gown suddenly hung off her changing body, exactly like a cruel, twisted joke. She pressed her shaking hands tightly to her swollen belly, hot, stinging tears threatening to violently spill over her eyelashes, and whispered into the quiet room, "I am so incredibly sorry, my sweet baby." She wasn't apologizing to the child for Jonathan's horrific betrayal. She was deeply, profoundly apologizing to her baby for ever believing his lies, for holding on to foolish hope, and for staying in the toxic marriage for as long as she had. But the absolute peak of her public humiliation occurred at the highly anticipated annual charity luncheon, just 2 agonizing weeks before the scheduled court hearing. Isabella hadn't originally planned to attend the event at all. It was a massive, high-profile luncheon that she and Jonathan had actually co-hosted together in the past, a beloved, yearly tradition specifically meant to raise millions of dollars in funds for local children's hospitals. But her father, William Blackwell, had sternly and lovingly insisted she go. "You absolutely cannot hide away in the dark, Isabella," he had told her over the phone, his voice a pillar of strength. "If you hide, you completely let him write the narrative of your life. Go to the event. Hold your head incredibly high, and show them you are a Blackwell." So, she went. She wore a strikingly simple, elegant cream-colored dress that skimmed beautifully over her pregnant belly, her chestnut hair pulled back severely into a chic, low chignon. She walked into the massive, crowded ballroom on violently trembling legs, aggressively forcing herself to make eye contact and meet the judging gazes of the wealthy women who had once claimed to be her closest friends. Some of them offered tight, uncomfortable smiles filled with awkward sympathy. Others actively turned their backs and avoided her entirely, exactly as though her betrayal and failure were somehow a contagious disease. And then, Jonathan arrived. He strode arrogantly into the charity luncheon exactly as though he personally owned the entire building, his arm wrapped firmly and proudly around Cassandra's narrow waist. She glittered blindingly in a skin-tight, sapphire blue designer dress, her loud, performative laughter echoing sharply across the marble hall, demanding everyone's attention. The horrific sight of them standing there together, looking so completely unbothered and happy, was exactly like a jagged blade violently twisting deep inside Isabella's chest. She gripped her cold glass of ice water tighter and tighter, the heavy condensation dripping down her shaking fingers like tears. The massive room immediately buzzed with excited, frantic whispers. Some polite guests tried desperately to pretend that absolutely nothing was wrong, that this was just business as usual. But the heavy, Judging stares followed Isabella absolutely. Everywhere she turned her head, she physically felt the hot, burning flush of embarrassment rising rapidly in her face. The suffocating, crushing weight of public humiliation pressing down so hard on her chest she could barely breathe. Unsurprisingly, it was the cruel Cassandra who decided to deliver the absolute, final, devastating blow of the afternoon. As Isabella finally surrendered and made her way quickly toward the exit doors to escape the staring eyes, Cassandra highly deliberately stepped right into her path, blocking her way with a bright, painted smile that was sharp enough to cut solid glass. Cassandra looked slowly and mockingly down at Isabella's prominent, swollen belly, and then slowly back up directly into her tear-filled eyes. "Wow, you look incredibly tired today, Isabella," she said with a sickly sweet, dripping tone, intentionally pitching her voice loud enough for the entire nearby crowd of socialites to hear her clearly. "I suppose being pregnant just doesn't physically suit everyone, does it?" The scattered laughter that immediately followed the cruel insult, soft, stifled, yet unbelievably vicious, burned Isabella's soul significantly hotter than fire. Jonathan stood right there and said absolutely nothing to defend his wife. He didn't even bother to glance at Isabella's devastated face. He simply tightened his protective arm around Cassandra's waist and smoothly guided her right past. His cold eyes fixed straight ahead, exactly as though his pregnant, weeping wife were completely invisible to him. In that horrific, agonizing moment, Isabella nearly broke completely in half. She stumbled blindly out into the quiet hotel hallway, her chest heaving violently, her vision completely blurred by the hot tears she fiercely, stubbornly refused to let fall in front of them. She desperately wanted to scream at the top of her lungs, to collapse onto the carpet, to just let the massive, unbearable pain completely consume her and end it all. But then, she felt it. A tiny, unmistakable flutter deep in her belly. It was the soft, powerful physical reminder of the innocent life actively growing inside her. Her sweet baby. Her child. And instantly, she clearly remembered her father's stern, loving words, "You cannot hide. If you do, you let him write the story." That very night, Isabella sat alone in the dim light of the nursery, staring blankly at the beautiful, unfinished wooden crib she had meticulously painted. One side of it a soft, soothing pastel blue just weeks ago, her brushstrokes trembling violently as she fought back racking sobs of despair. But tonight, instead of giving in to the dark abyss of depression, she made a definitive, life-altering choice. She picked up her cell phone, dialed her father's private number, and said 3 simple words that completely changed the trajectory of absolutely everything. "I'm ready now." The very next morning, William Blackwell's elite legal team descended upon her penthouse exactly like a highly coordinated Category 5 hurricane. They aggressively gathered mountains of financial documents, subpoenaed bank records, collected high-resolution photographs, and compiled absolutely everything they could possibly need to build an impenetrable, ironclad case. Isabella willingly handed over the secret, second cell phone she had found hidden in Jonathan's office, granting them full access to every single illicit text message, deleted email, and scandalous photo she had quietly and meticulously collected over the months. She signed the heavy stacks of legal papers with incredibly steady hands, her pregnant belly pressing firmly against the mahogany table, her dark eyes blazing brightly with a fierce, terrifying strength she hadn't felt in many months. The betrayal had deeply humiliated her. It had brutally cut her heart into a million pieces. But now, those jagged pieces were being expertly forged under pressure into impenetrable armor. Word rapidly spread through the elite circles of the city that Isabella Blackwell Colton absolutely wasn't going to just vanish quietly into the night. As expected, hungry reporters quickly caught wind of the terrifying, massive legal team she had assembled. Frantic whispers quickly filled the exclusive country clubs and high-end salons. She's actually fighting back. She's bringing the full weight of her father down on him. Jonathan arrogantly dismissed the rumors at first, laughing them off. She won't actually do anything, he sneered confidently to Cassandra one evening, lazily swirling a heavy crystal glass of expensive whiskey in his hand. She's far too weak and pathetic. She simply doesn't have the guts to fight me. Cassandra smirked wickedly and kissed his cheek, happily feeding his fatal delusion. But Isabella knew the absolute truth. She had guts. She had immense strength. And she had something powerful that a narcissist like Jonathan would absolutely never, ever understand, a profound reason to fight that went far beyond mere ego or the accumulation of wealth. She absolutely wasn't just fighting for her own pride anymore. She was fiercely fighting for her child's entire future, for her own stolen dignity, and for every single woman in the world who had ever been publicly humiliated and discarded by the man who swore before God to love and protect her. And when the highly anticipated court date finally arrived, Isabella was absolutely no longer the broken, weeping woman who had fled the charity luncheon in tears. She was the terrifying, undeniable storm walking boldly through the heavy courthouse doors. The incredibly public betrayal had destroyed her old self once, but now, that very same betrayal would serve as the exact weapon used to completely destroy Jonathan Colton. Every single strong woman in the world has a defining moment when the crushing weight of betrayal threatens to completely and utterly crush her spirit into dust. For Isabella, that terrifying moment came very late one night, standing entirely alone in the massive, echoing, lonely halls of the Colton estate. The door to the baby's nursery stood slightly ajar. The soft, hand-painted, pastel walls beautifully bathed in pale, silver moonlight. Tiny, pristine cotton clothes lay neatly and lovingly folded in the dresser drawers. A soft, Stuffed. Velvet Rabbit sat perched patiently on the wooden rocking chair, silently, waiting for the arrival of an innocent baby who absolutely deserved a loving, united family, not a toxic, bloody battlefield. Isabella stood frozen in the doorway, resting one protective hand gently on her swollen belly, and using the other to tightly grip the wooden doorframe just to maintain her physical balance. Hot, silent tears streamed steadily down her pale cheeks as she whispered into the dark room, "I just wanted this all to be perfect for you. I wanted you to have so much love." Her child shifted heavily inside her womb, a small, beautiful flutter of life, gently reminding her that she absolutely wasn't standing in this house alone. But in that agonizing moment, she felt more profoundly, terrifyingly isolated than she ever had in her entire life. Jonathan hadn't come home at all that night. He hadn't come home for many nights in a row now. His flimsy, pathetic excuses had long since run completely dry, and his transparent lies were as fragile and easily seen through as cheap glass. She intimately knew exactly where he was right now, happily wrapped up in Cassandra's eager arms, proudly parading his affair through the elite clubs of Manhattan entirely without a shred of shame or guilt. And yet, despite knowing the ugly truth, her massive, king-sized bed still felt far too big, far too freezing cold, and far too empty without his presence beside her. Isabella sank heavily into the wooden rocking chair, desperately clutching the soft stuffed rabbit tightly to her chest exactly as though it were a physical lifeline pulling her from the ocean. Her erratic breaths came in very short, painful gasps, and loud, racking sobs finally broke free from her chest despite her desperate, exhausting attempts to stay completely composed and strong. "Why wasn't I ever enough for him?" she whispered brokenly into the quiet, empty room. "Why wasn't our family enough to make him stay?" The horrible, complex truth that she simply couldn't bring herself to admit out loud was that a small, broken part of her heart actually still loved him. A pathetic part of her still desperately longed for the kind, attentive man who once tightly held her hand in the dark movie theater, who romantically whispered grand promises of forever against her skin, who gently kissed her forehead, exactly as though she were the absolute most precious, irreplaceable thing in the entire world. That good man had completely vanished into thin air, entirely replaced by a monster of pure arrogance and cruelty. But her traumatized heart simply hadn't fully caught up to the harsh reality yet. It stubbornly, foolishly, clung to the fading memory of a love that no longer existed, even as the brutal, daily reality actively bled her soul dry. In the dark, lonely days that immediately followed, her emotional collapse deepened severely. Isabella completely stopped leaving the massive house. The heavy velvet curtains remained permanently drawn shut across the windows, completely shutting out the bright sunlight exactly as though she could successfully hide her pain from the entire world. Delicious, catered food entirely lost its taste, turning to ash in her mouth. Sleep became incredibly fitful and rare, constantly plagued by horrifying, vivid nightmares of Jonathan's booming laughter violently tangled together with Cassandra's shrill, mocking giggles. Her father, William, visited the estate very often, his physical presence always steady and grounding, his words highly encouraging and loving. But even the great William Blackwell, a ruthless titan who had successfully faced down hostile corporate boardrooms and single-handedly toppled massive business rivals without ever blinking an eye, felt completely and utterly powerless against the agonizing sight of his only beloved daughter actively crumbling to pieces before his eyes. One terrible evening, he arrived at the house and found her sitting blankly on the hardwood floor of the nursery. The wooden crib lay entirely unassembled all around her, with metal screws and wooden slats scattered chaotically across the rug, looking exactly like the broken, fragmented pieces of her shattered life. She simply stared blankly at the wooden pieces, fresh tears constantly streaking down her exhausted face. "Dad," she whispered hoarsely, her voice completely broken. "I honestly don't know if I can do this anymore. I don't know if I have the strength to raise this baby all alone." William immediately dropped to his knees beside her on the floor, his large, warm hand completely covering her small, trembling one. "You are absolutely not alone in this world, Isabella. You have me. You have the entire backing of this family, and you have significantly more strength inside you than you even realize right now." But Isabella just shook her head slowly, her fragile shoulders trembling with fresh sobs. "He was supposed to love me, Dad. He was supposed to be right here with us. And now absolutely all I feel inside is completely empty." The terrifying, suffocating emptiness actively threatened to completely consume her soul. One particular night, entirely unable to sleep, Isabella wandered aimlessly like a ghost into Jonathan's massive home office. The dark room heavily reeked of stale cigar smoke, expensive scotch, and ruthless ambition. The massive mahogany desk was highly cluttered with complex legal documents and glossy PR photos that meant absolutely nothing to her broken heart. She slowly ran her trembling fingers along the highly polished wood of the desk, painfully remembering the many nights she used to lovingly bring him warm, homemade dinner, waiting patiently on the leather sofa while he finished his endless phone calls, foolishly believing they were building a beautiful, secure future together. Sitting squarely on the very corner of his desk lay a heavy, silver-framed photograph. It was Jonathan and Isabella joyfully cutting the cake at their Lafis wedding. She looked so incredibly young in the photo, so breathtakingly radiant, her bright eyes shining with limitless hope and pure joy. He stood tall and handsome beside her, his strong arm wrapped protectively around her waist, his smile incredibly confident and seemingly full of genuine love. For a terrifying moment, Isabella's weak knees actually buckled beneath her weight. She picked up the heavy silver frame with shaking hands, staring obsessively at the frozen, happy image of a profound love that had completely turned to toxic ash. With a sudden, primal, agonizing cry of pure rage that tore violently from the absolute deepest part of her soul, she hurled the heavy frame as hard as she could directly against the brick wall. The glass violently shattered upon impact. Sharp, glittering shards scattered explosively across the polished hardwood floor, looking exactly like thousands of broken, useless promises. She completely collapsed to her knees among the wreckage, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. The devastating, raw sound echoing loudly through the massive, empty office. "How could you possibly do this to me?" she screamed to the empty room. "How could you do this to us?" The dark, emotional spiral was utterly relentless. Even her own physical body seemed to be actively betraying her. The morning nausea grew significantly stronger. The deep bone fatigue felt incredibly heavier, and a dull, constant back pain gnawed at her with every single step she took. Pregnancy was supposedly meant to be a beautiful time of pure joy, of breathless anticipation for the future. Instead, it had entirely become a horrifying, daily physical reminder of her cruel abandonment, a massive, physical weight constantly pressing down hard on her fragile spirit. One terrifying evening, she collapsed suddenly on the cold bathroom floor, her pale cheek pressing hard against the freezing marble tile, her hot tears completely soaking her matted hair. Her panicked breathing came in very short, shallow gasps, a severe panic attack violently tightening her chest until she couldn't breathe. She clutched her swollen belly in absolute terror, utterly terrified that her extreme emotional stress was actively harming the innocent baby inside her. "Please," she whispered frantically through her violent sobs, rocking back and forth. "Please, my sweet baby, just hold on. I swear I promise you I'll be strong for you soon. Just please hold on." It was undeniably her absolute lowest point. It was the terrifying, dark point where simply giving up entirely felt like the absolute only viable option left to her. But sometimes, a total, devastating collapse is exactly what is necessary to finally clear the rubble away for a spectacular rebirth. As she lay there on the cold tiles, trembling violently and feeling entirely broken, Isabella suddenly remembered her late mother's gentle voice. It was a childhood memory so incredibly vivid and loud it felt exactly like her mother's. Ghost was standing right there in the bathroom with her. "Strength absolutely doesn't always roar like a lion, my sweet Isabella. Sometimes it just whispers softly. Sometimes true strength is simply making the choice to stand back up on your feet when you fall." She slowly wiped her hot tears away with violently shaking hands. Very slowly, incredibly painfully, she forced herself to push her heavy body off the freezing, hard floor. She stood up, her legs wobbling precariously, but she remained standing. She looked deeply into the bathroom mirror. Her dark eyes were bloodshot, red, and heavily swollen from crying. Her cheeks were incredibly pale and gaunt. But her reflection finally told a completely different story. A story she simply couldn't ignore any longer. She wasn't just a pathetic, betrayed, discarded wife. She wasn't just a weak, helpless victim of a narcissist. She was a fierce, protective mother. And strong. Mothers absolutely do not ever surrender to the wolves. That profound, life-altering realization instantly became the very first, golden thread of real hope weaving its powerful way back into her shattered soul. She confidently walked back into the nursery the very next morning and picked up the scattered metal screws from the floor. Piece by painstaking piece, she systematically assembled the heavy wooden crib entirely by herself. Her hands, finally steady despite her bone-deep physical exhaustion. Each firm turn of the metal screwdriver felt incredibly symbolic to her, a small, powerful act of absolute defiance against the dark despair that tried to claim her. When the beautiful crib finally stood complete and sturdy in the center of the room, she sat down peacefully beside it. Her belly rose and fell rhythmically with each deep, calming breath, and she whispered softly to her child, "We're going to be absolutely okay now. I promise you." Her father, William, arrived later that same day to check on her, and was shocked to find her standing significantly taller, her dark eyes vastly clearer and focused. The devastating emotional collapse had absolutely not destroyed her, as he feared. It had beautifully, powerfully forged her into steel. William saw the miraculous change in her instantly. "There's my strong girl," he said softly. Immense, genuine pride breaking easily through his usual stern corporate facade. Isabella obviously wasn't entirely magically healed overnight. She absolutely still cried softly some lonely nights. Her heart still physically ached whenever she accidentally saw Jonathan's handsome, lying face plastered on a business magazine cover at the store. But the total emotional collapse had effectively burned away the dangerous, naive illusion of her own weakness. What remained in the ashes was something significantly stronger than solid steel. And Jonathan, living in his blind, massive arrogance, would absolutely never, ever see it coming. Because the fragile woman he firmly thought was completely broken beyond all repair was now aggressively, methodically preparing to rise up. And when she finally did, she would violently, unapologetically bring him crashing to his knees. The terrible collapse had very nearly ended her life. But it also miraculously gave birth to the unstoppable, terrifying storm she was about to officially become. The grand courtroom smelled heavily of highly polished mahogany wood, old legal paper, and thick, suffocating anticipation. Jonathan Colton sat highly, confidently at the front defense table, his broad shoulders pulled back, his strong jaw set tight. He was expertly wearing the smug, relaxed mask of an arrogant man who firmly thought total legal victory was already safely secured. In his pocket, seated just a few rows behind him in the gallery, Cassandra, openly smirked, her bright red lipstick gleaming wetly under the harsh fluorescent lights, acting exactly as though this highly serious legal hearing were absolutely nothing more than a cheap, entertaining performance staged purely for her personal amusement. But what absolutely neither of them knew, as they sat there glowing in their arrogance, was that Isabella had confidently come into this room armed with significantly more than just her reclaimed dignity. She had walked through those doors armed with absolute, unquenchable fire. The brilliant, devastating twist in the case had actually begun to take shape several days before the formal hearing even started. In the extreme privacy of her father's massive, highly secured penthouse office, a sprawling room heavily lined with leather-bound books and imposing oil portraits of intimidating Blackwell ancestors, Isabella laid out her ultimate battle plan. She absolutely wasn't just casually filing for a standard divorce to get away from him. She wasn't just politely demanding a fair amount of basic child support. She was actively, meticulously preparing to completely dismantle Jonathan's entire billion-dollar corporate empire, pulling it apart brick by bloody brick. Her father, the formidable William Blackwell, sat comfortably across the massive mahogany desk from her. His piercing, icy blue eyes deeply studied her face with a highly complex mixture of profound fatherly pride and deep, lingering sorrow for her pain. You deeply understand, Isabella, that once we officially start this massive legal war, there is absolutely no turning back the clock. He will absolutely never forgive you for this. He will aggressively try to retaliate using the media. Are you truly, fully ready for that kind of ugly, public war? Isabella's hand instinctively flew to rest protectively on her swollen belly. She felt a very strong, highly steady kick from the baby, and she confidently lifted her chin, her eyes locking with her father's. I've secretly been living in a terrible, active war zone for the last year. Already, Dad. I just stupidly didn't realize I was under attack. But this time around, I absolutely won't be fighting the battle alone. William leaned back deeply into his leather chair, a very slow, highly dangerous, predatory smile forming on his lips. Good. Because I've been impatiently waiting for you to finally say those exact words to me. The absolute first lethal weapon in Isabella's legal arsenal was irrefutable knowledge. She had systematically, quietly collected many months' worth of damning, hard evidence, high-resolution photos, highly explicit text messages, downloaded from his secret phone, luxury hotel receipts, and absolute, undeniable proof of Jonathan's highly reckless, illegal spending of company money on Cassandra. Every single secret, hush phone call, every late night, illicit rendezvous, every incredibly extravagant piece of diamond jewelry, purchased illegally using their joint marital assets. It was all neatly, meticulously compiled into thick, red legal folders that William's elite team of corporate lawyers devoured hungrily, exactly like starving predators sensing fresh blood in the water. The second massive weapon she held was raw, unadulterated power. Jonathan arrogantly believed he was completely untouchable simply because of his new, flashy wealth. But what his massive ego fundamentally failed to logically consider was the fact that William Blackwell's legendary, multigenerational, global empire completely and utterly dwarfed his own. William absolutely didn't need to loudly flaunt his immense wealth with cheap charity galas and trashy mistresses to feel important. He wielded his massive financial power incredibly quietly, highly decisively, and with an absolutely devastating, lethal precision that terrified global markets. When the Blackwell family formally entered a courtroom, they absolutely didn't just show up to fight a case. They showed up to entirely conquer and salt the earth. And the third, most devastating weapon in her arsenal was the ironclad prenuptial agreement. Jonathan, highly paranoid about protecting his assets, had aggressively insisted on signing a strict prenup right before their marriage. He had been incredibly smug in his absolute, arrogant belief that he was smartly protecting himself from a potential gold digger, completely unaware of her true net worth. Isabella, completely and foolishly blinded by her pure love for him at the time, had happily signed the document entirely without hesitation or reading the fine print. But what Jonathan had absolutely never realized was that William Blackwell's ruthless team of corporate lawyers had extensively reviewed the contract in total silence beforehand. They had highly expertly, almost invisibly, slipped in several incredibly subtle, lethal legal clauses so incredibly buried in complex legal jargon that Jonathan and his cheaper lawyers hadn't even noticed them. These were highly specific clauses that now legally gave Isabella the absolute, undeniable upper hand to destroy him financially. On the freezing morning of the hearing, Isabella walked confidently into the massive, echoing courthouse entirely flanked by her powerful father and his intimidating army of elite legal sharks. Flashbulbs erupted like a violent lightning storm. Reporters shouted her name frantically over the noise. Dozens of microphones jetted aggressively forward into her path. For many long, agonizing months, she had been completely invisible, cruelly erased from society by Jonathan's blinding arrogance. But now, absolutely every single eye in the city was glued to her every move. She was absolutely no longer playing the role of the weeping, pathetic victim. The press saw the change in her instantly. She was the storm. Jonathan's handsome face instantly drained of all natural color the exact moment he saw the imposing William Blackwell walk through the double doors. The older billionaire's mere physical presence in the room was exactly like a dark, heavy thundercloud rolling menacingly into the space, suffocating, heavy, and completely unyielding. He absolutely didn't even need to speak a single word to instantly command total authority. His terrifying, legendary reputation spoke loudly for him, and when he stepped up and placed his large hand highly protectively on Isabella's shoulder, Jonathan's smug, curated composure noticeably cracked, a bead of nervous sweat forming on his brow. The stern judge quickly called the chaotic room to order, her heavy wooden gavel striking the block sharply. Mr. and Mrs. Colton, we are officially here today to formally proceed with your divorce petition. Counsel, please stand and state your appearances for the court record. Jonathan's highly paid, expensive attorney rose quickly to his feet, looking highly polished and oozing false confidence. Richard Evans, proudly representing Mr. Jonathan Colton, Your Honor. Then, the imposing William slowly stood up to his full, intimidating height. He was absolutely not a practicing lawyer, but a true titan of industry. William Blackwell, officially representing my daughter, Isabella Blackwell. The collective, highly audible gasp of shock that erupted from the packed public gallery was practically deafening. Reporters in the back rows frantically, scribbled the massive scoop into their notebooks. Jonathan's flashy mistress shifted highly uncomfortably in her wooden seat, her arrogant, red-lipped smirk severely faltering and slipping for the very first time. The legal battle officially began with Jonathan's aggressive attorney attempting to paint a highly false, insulting narrative. He tried to paint Isabella as incredibly fragile, entirely financially dependent, and as a pathetic, lazy woman who absolutely could not survive a single day in the real world without Jonathan's massive fortune sustaining her lifestyle. She has lived in extreme, unimaginable luxury entirely because of the hard work and brilliance of my client, Your Honor, Evans declared loudly to the room. She had absolutely everything she could ever possibly want in life. Yet she selfishly chose to completely abandon him and his home during the absolute most crucial, stressful years of building his corporate business. We are respectfully asking the court for a highly swift, clean dissolution of this marriage, with very limited, basic financial compensation awarded to her, as per the signed prenuptial agreement. But the brilliant William Blackwell was entirely ready for the attack. He rose incredibly slowly from his chair, adjusting his suit jacket. His deep voice was remarkably calm, but it was absolutely lethal in its delivery. Everything she ever wanted? William scoffed, his voice dripping with venomous disdain. My brilliant daughter simply wanted a loyal husband who fundamentally respected her and their vows. Instead, she was served nothing but constant betrayal, cruel emotional abandonment, and massive, horrific public humiliation, all while carrying his innocent child. And as for this supposed extreme luxury you speak of, let us absolutely not forget for 1 second that Jonathan Colton's so-called self-made empire originally began its rise explicitly using massive amounts of Blackwell corporate funding. Without our initial, highly generous seed money, he would absolutely still be hustling cheap real estate deals out of a rented, leaky office in Queens. Jonathan physically flinched in his chair as if he had been slapped across the face. Cassandra's sharp acrylic nails dug so painfully into her own arm that They left deep red marks. And then, unexpectedly, Isabella finally spoke. For the very first time in the hearing, she slowly rose to her feet. Her hands, resting on the defense table, were incredibly steady, completely belying the frantic, terrified tremor beating in her heart. "Your Honor," she said, her clear, strong voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room. "This case is absolutely not just about a simple financial divorce. This is entirely about basic human dignity and corporate fraud. My husband did not simply betray his marriage vows in the privacy of our home. He maliciously, intentionally made a massive, public spectacle of his adultery. He proudly paraded his mistress in front of the press and my peers while I was at home carrying his firstborn child. I have brought extensive, undeniable hard evidence today to completely prove his gross misconduct, not just his moral misconduct against me personally, but his highly illegal financial misconduct against the strict terms of our signed marriage contract." She smoothly handed a massive, incredibly thick red folder directly to the court bailiff, who carried it to the bench. Inside the folder were dozens of high-resolution photos, hundreds of printed, explicit text messages, and highly detailed financial receipts, all serving as absolute, irrefutable proof of Jonathan's towering arrogance and blatant corporate theft. The stern judge slowly flipped through the thick stack of damning documents, her brow furrowing significantly deeper and darker with every single page she read. Jonathan shifted highly uncomfortably in his leather chair, leaning forward. "Those photos absolutely don't legally mean anything in a no-fault state," he snapped, his voice rising in panic. "Every wealthy man in this city has—" William Blackwell violently interrupted him, his booming voice cutting through the air exactly like a sharp steel blade. "Every real man absolutely does not casually abandon his heavily pregnant, loyal wife just to proudly flaunt a cheap mistress under the chandeliers of a charity gala. Every real man does not illegally siphon millions in joint marital assets just to buy expensive diamond bracelets for another woman. Do not ever confuse your own pathetic, disgusting moral failures with true manhood. Jonathan." The packed courtroom immediately erupted in loud, shocked murmurs and frantic gasps. Jonathan's handsome face flushed a deep, humiliating crimson red with rage and embarrassment. But the absolute final, devastating twist to the knife came when William calmly slid one last, single legal document smoothly across the polished table. "The prenuptial agreement," Jonathan sneered loudly, pointing a shaking finger at the paper, desperately trying to regain some semblance of control. "That legally protects me and my assets. William, not her." William's icy blue eyes gleamed with a cold, terrifying, predatory satisfaction. "You really should have bothered to read the fine print significantly more carefully before you signed it, Jonathan. Specifically, I draw your attention to Section 14, Paragraph 2. It explicitly states, in the proven event of marital adultery, the faithful spouse shall immediately retain 100% controlling interest in all joint financial assets, corporate holdings, as well as absolute, sole parental custody rights. It was legally signed by you and properly witnessed by two of your own incompetent attorneys. The judge slowly adjusted her reading glasses on her nose, carefully scanning the highlighted legal clause in the document before her. After a tense, agonizing moment of silence, her heavy wooden gavel struck the block once with a loud crack. "The clause is entirely legally valid and highly enforceable," she stated firmly. Jonathan's mouth physically fell open in absolute, unadulterated horror. Cassandra, sitting in the gallery, went entirely pale, looking as though she were about to violently faint or vomit. The press pool in the back of the room scribbled so frantically that pens tore through paper. In that single, spectacular instant, the entire balance of power in their world shifted permanently. Isabella, the woman who had once been so deeply humiliated, the wife who had been so cruelly pitted by the entire city, now stood incredibly tall and entirely victorious. The undeniable hard evidence, the cleverly hidden prenup trap, the terrifying, unshakable physical presence of William Blackwell. Standing beside her, it was all a massive, perfectly and beautifully orchestrated symphony of pure, poetic justice. Jonathan slumped heavily back into his leather chair, totally defeated. His entire facade of arrogant bravado completely collapsing into dust right under the immense, crushing weight of his own blinding arrogance. Cassandra's smug, painted smirk was entirely gone, rapidly replaced with a horrifying, ugly mask of pure, selfish fear for her own financial future. The massive gallery actively buzzed with noise, the whispers now highly celebratory and even filled with genuine awe for the brilliant legal maneuver. And Isabella? She simply sat up incredibly tall in her chair, her warm hand resting highly protectively on her swollen belly, her dark eyes incredibly calm and totally resolute. She absolutely didn't gloat like a villain. She didn't stoop to sneer at him or his mistress. She simply met Jonathan's devastated, panicked gaze with the quiet, profound, terrifying strength of a woman who had been completely broken down, meticulously rebuilt, and magnificently reborn from the fire. The brilliant twist was finally complete. The pathetic, betrayed wife was absolutely no longer weak prey to be hunted. She was the massive, unstoppable storm that had only just begun to roar across his life. The very morning immediately following the explosive prenup revelation in court, the entire city of New York woke up buzzing with electric, frantic energy. Massive, bold font headlines screamed loudly across absolutely every single front page on the newsstands. Billionaire Jonathan Colton completely blindsided in court. Betrayed wife and the massive Blackwell empire strike back hard. Pregnant heiress Isabella. Blackwell stuns entire courtroom with brilliant power move. The incredible underdog story was absolutely everywhere on television and social media. Isabella, the quiet woman who had been completely invisible and silent. For long, agonizing months, was suddenly the entire city's most universally talked about, admired woman. And for the very first time in a very long time, she wasn't being looked at with pathetic pity. She was being looked at with profound, deep respect. But true, lasting transformation isn't solely about changing the fickle tide of public perception. It always, fundamentally, must begin deeply within the soul. For agonizing weeks, Isabella had been nothing more than a pale, weeping shadow of herself, constantly hiding away behind heavily drawn velvet curtains, slowly drowning in an ocean of public humiliation and self-loathing. Now, as she stood confidently before the massive, ornate mirror in her father's luxurious penthouse, she barely even recognized the powerful woman staring fiercely back at her. Her dark eyes were significantly sharper and more focused. Her posture and shoulders were perfectly straight, and her overall physical presence was incredibly commanding in a powerful way she had never, ever imagined possible. For herself, her newly hired, highly exclusive personal stylist, a sharp-eyed woman named Marissa, who had successfully worked with A-list celebrities and powerful CEOs' wives for decades, hovered quietly behind her, meticulously adjusting the sleek hem of a perfectly tailored, elegant black dress. You absolutely don't need to wear flashy sequins or massive, gaudy diamonds to be seen anymore, Isabella, Marissa murmured softly, smoothing the expensive fabric. Your own inner strength is your biggest, loudest statement piece now. Keep it simple, highly elegant, and completely unshakable. Isabella gently touched the soft, heavy fabric, feeling its comforting weight against her skin. It absolutely wasn't just about simple vanity or looking pretty for the cameras. It was entirely about putting on psychological armor. For long, miserable months, she had been cruelly, publicly ridiculed by Cassandra and Jonathan for her swollen, pregnant belly, maliciously mocked for looking naturally tired and weak. Now, she fiercely, proudly embraced it all. Her pregnancy absolutely wasn't an ugly flaw to be hidden under baggy sweaters. It was the absolute source of her massive, maternal power. She proudly carried innocent, beautiful life inside her, while the arrogant Jonathan currently carried nothing but massive, highly public shame. William smoothly entered the large dressing room, his hard, calculating gaze instantly softening with love at the stunning sight of his daughter. You look exactly like your beautiful mother right now, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. She had that exact same intense fire burning in her eyes whenever she confidently walked into a crowded room, completely ready to prove herself to the world. Isabella smiled faintly, adjusting a simple pearl earring. I honestly don't feel like her right now, Dad. I feel completely different. I feel significantly stronger. It almost feels exactly like absolutely everything that was so deeply broken inside me just had to be violently broken down completely. so that something entirely new and beautiful could finally grow in its place. Her father walked over and placed a very warm, heavy, incredibly supportive hand firmly on her shoulder. That's absolutely not different, Isabella. That is exactly who you have always been deep down inside. You just didn't know it yet until you were tested. That very same afternoon, Isabella boldly made her first highly anticipated major public appearance since the dramatic court hearing concluded. It was a massive, high-profile charity fundraiser proudly hosted at the Blackwell Group's towering global headquarters, an event her father had once successfully managed entirely alone, but now fiercely insisted she stand up and officially co-host with him. The sleek, towering glass and steel skyscraper glittered brilliantly against the bright Manhattan skyline. Its massive, sprawling lobby had been completely transformed into a chaotic, highly energized stage for hundreds of flashing cameras, shouting reporters, and the city's absolute most powerful, wealthy, elite. When the door of the armored black SUV finally opened and Isabella confidently stepped out onto the red carpet, the massive, noisy crowd instantly hushed in sheer awe. Gone entirely was the timid, fragile woman who once slipped quietly and unnoticed into the back of crowded rooms. She walked proudly down the carpet, with her head held incredibly high, one hand resting highly protectively and proudly on her pregnant belly, her sleek, elegant black dress flowing beautifully and powerfully around her legs. Hundreds of bright flashbulbs violently erupted like a lightning storm, but she absolutely didn't flinch or look away. She warmly welcomed the light. A brave, shouting reporter shoved a microphone aggressively toward the barricade. Mrs. Colton. Isabella, do you have any official, final words today for your disgraced husband? Isabella paused her confident stride, turning slowly to face the cameras. Her dark gaze incredibly steady and lethal. Yes, she said simply, her clear, strong voice carrying perfectly through the dozens of microphones. Every single woman on this earth absolutely deserves basic human respect, and every single innocent child absolutely deserves a safe, warm home built entirely on love, and absolutely not built on betrayal. That is all I will ever say on the matter. The entire room erupted in massive, deafening applause and cheers of support. The explosive, front-page headline for tomorrow's paper was instantly written in. That very moment, Isabella Blackwell, the incredible woman who turned brutal betrayal into absolute power. Inside the glittering gala, Isabella easily mingled with billionaire investors, famous philanthropists, and wealthy socialites who had once looked down on her and pitied her. Now, they all looked at her with deep, genuine admiration, and even a hint of terrified awe. She was absolutely no longer just Jonathan's quiet wife. She was Isabella Blackwell, a powerful heiress, a fierce mother, a resilient survivor, and a massive, unstoppable force of nature entirely in her Own right. But true. Profound transformation is absolutely never just external. Behind the highly elegant, polished facade, Isabella's bruised heart had fundamentally, permanently shifted. 2. She absolutely no longer craved Jonathan's toxic, fleeting approval. She absolutely no longer spent her nights crying and replaying their old, happy memories with a sense of desperate longing. Instead, she methodically replayed the harsh, brutal lessons his ultimate betrayal had successfully taught her about the world. She realized with deep sadness that she had spent years quietly silencing her own brilliant voice merely for the sake of keeping the peace in the name of love. Now, she spoke up in rooms with absolute clarity, deep authority, and unshakable courage. Her inner confidence grew massively with each passing day. She actively joined her father in high-stakes corporate board meetings. Her incredibly sharp, brilliant business observations completely surprising and highly impressing even the most seasoned, cynical executives in the room. She walked confidently through the bustling corridors of the Blackwell Group, absolutely not as a polite visitor, but as a respected, future leader of the company. And slowly, beautifully, she finally began to vividly envision a happy life completely beyond the heartbreak. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was absolutely thriving. Jonathan, meanwhile, was spectacularly, publicly unraveling at the seams. Absolutely every newspaper, every single television news channel, and every single social media platform gleefully carried the highly detailed, embarrassing story of his massive downfall. Nervous, wealthy investors quickly grew terrified of the bad PR and entirely withdrew their millions in funding. Long-time corporate partners aggressively severed all their business ties with his firm to save their own reputations. Cassandra, the very woman who was once so incredibly proud to stand smugly by his side in the spotlight, immediately began to rapidly distance herself the exact second the glitter and the money began to fade away. Jonathan had arrogantly thought he was completely untouchable like a god, but now the entire city was eagerly watching him violently crumble into dust. And it was Isabella's stunning, powerful transformation that had ultimately lit the explosive fuse. Still, Isabella absolutely wasn't finished with her journey. Her massive transformation was absolutely not just about petty revenge against a bad man. It was entirely about her own total liberation. She no longer felt any burning desire to prove her worth to Jonathan. She solely wanted to prove her incredible worth to herself. One peaceful, starry night, after a particularly long, exhausting day of high-level corporate meetings, Isabella stood entirely alone on the massive, sweeping balcony of her father's penthouse. The glittering, endless city lights stretched out beautifully and endlessly before her like a blanket of stars. She gently pressed her warm hand to her swollen belly and whispered softly into the night air, "We are absolutely going to be okay, little one. You and me." We're going to build a beautiful, incredible life entirely filled with pure love. Not with toxic lies. I promise you. The baby kicked strongly, exactly as if joyfully answering her promise. The profound transformation was finally, beautifully complete. She absolutely wasn't just a pathetic, betrayed wife anymore. She absolutely wasn't just a fragile daughter needing to be protected. She was a powerful woman completely, reborn from the ashes, carrying innocent life and massive, unstoppable strength in perfectly equal measure. And the massive city below wasn't just silently watching her anymore. It was loudly, actively cheering her on. Because Isabella Blackwell had successfully gone from suffering extreme, public humiliation to achieving absolute, undeniable triumph. She had gone from enduring the quiet, cruel whispers of pity to commanding the screaming, bold headlines of pure power. She had gone from weeping alone on the cold floor of a nursery to confidently commanding massive rooms entirely filled with the world's most powerful, wealthy elite. Her ultimate makeover wasn't just found in the expensive cut of her black dress or the elegant styling of her hair. It was found deep in the very core of her soul. She had been brutally broken. Yes, but in that terrible breaking, she had finally, beautifully discovered the incredibly strong, sharp pieces of herself she had never even known existed. And with those jagged, sharp pieces, she successfully built an entirely new identity, one that was vastly stronger and more impenetrable than anything the arrogant Jonathan could ever possibly hope to destroy. The profound transformation was absolutely no longer just her own personal victory story. It instantly became a massive, empowering anthem for absolutely every single woman in the world who had ever been cruelly betrayed and discarded by a weak man. And very soon, Jonathan Colton would finally, painfully learn exactly what it meant to face the terrifying wrath of a woman who had proudly risen from her own ashes. The massive, opulent ballroom glittered blindingly, looking exactly like the inside of a priceless, antique jewel box. Giant crystal chandeliers dripped with warm, golden light from the high, vaulted ceilings. A string quartet of violins played incredibly softly in the background, and Manhattan's most powerful, wealthy elite completely filled the air with loud, confident chatter and the sound of clinking, vintage champagne glasses. It was the highly prestigious annual Empire Business Awards Gala. It was a massive, highly publicized night specifically meant to formally honor the absolute best and most powerful in the city's corporate world. It was a night that Jonathan Colton desperately, foolishly believed would miraculously restore his rapidly failing public reputation. He had aggressively pulled absolutely every single corrupt political and business string he could reach just to ensure his desperate nomination for Entrepreneur of the Year. He desperately needed the massive public stage, the roaring applause, and the ultimate, shining validation of his peers to stroke his fragile, crumbling ego. After weeks of suffering brutal, non-stop humiliation in the global press. He delusionally saw this specific gala as his one shot at a glorious comeback. Cassandra clung desperately tightly to his arm, her highly revealing sapphire blue designer gown looking incredibly daring, her painted smile looking incredibly sharp and forced. Together, they arrogantly walked into the crowded room exactly as though absolutely nothing terrible had happened, acting as though the massive, highly public scandal hadn't already reduced Jonathan's entire corporate empire to smoldering ashes. But tonight, the grand stage ultimately belonged to someone else entirely. When Isabella gracefully entered the massive ballroom, the very air in the room seemed to violently shift in pressure. Hundreds of heads instantly turned in unison. Loud, booming conversations stopped entirely mid-sentence. She was breathtakingly, undeniably radiant in a flowing, custom emerald green gown that perfectly hugged her pregnant form exactly like a royal crown jewel. Her dark hair was swept elegantly back from her face, and her physical presence was utterly, undeniably commanding. Standing firmly and protectively at her side was her father, the legendary William Blackwell, his massive, imposing figure, radiating a silent, terrifying, lethal power. Scores of hungry reporters immediately surged forward against the velvet ropes, their camera lenses flashing furiously and blindingly. The excited, frantic whispers flew rapidly across the massive room like wildfire. She actually came. Oh my God! She actually showed up to face him. Jonathan's arrogant, smug smile instantly faltered, dropping from his face. The crystal champagne glass in his hand actually trembled slightly, spilling a few drops onto his expensive tuxedo shoe. Cassandra's sharp acrylic nails dug painfully, nervously into his arm, her panicked eyes darting wildly around the room, searching for an exit. The tense evening unfolded with all of its usual boring corporate pomp and circumstance, endless, dull awards, long-winded speeches, and polite, scattered applause. Jonathan sat incredibly stiffly in his chair near the front, nervously waiting for his specific category to be announced, desperately clinging to the fading, pathetic illusion that this night would serve as his grand, ultimate redemption. But as the famous guest presenter confidently approached the wooden podium to announce the next award, Isabella calmly and purposefully rose from her front row seat. "Excuse me," her clear, strong voice rang out, incredibly calm yet fiercely commanding. The sensitive microphone on the podium easily caught her words, and suddenly, the entire massive ballroom fell into a dead, terrified silence. She walked incredibly gracefully up the steps and onto the main stage, absolutely every single eye in the room hypnotically following her every move. When she finally stood directly at the podium, the emerald green silk fabric of her gown shimmering beautifully under the harsh stage lights, she absolutely did not look anything like a broken, discarded wife. She looked exactly like a powerful, avenging queen aggressively reclaiming her stolen throne. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice perfectly steady and unwavering, echoing clearly through the massive speakers. "I honestly hadn't originally planned to speak to all of you tonight, but I realized something profound as I sat here quietly in the audience, watching this massive, glittering celebration of supposed success." She paused, letting the heavy silence build. "True success in this world is absolutely not measured in millions of dollars in a bank account. It is absolutely not measured in corporate power, or even in the volume of the applause you receive in rooms like this. True, lasting success is measured entirely in basic human integrity." She paused again, her dark, lethal gaze locking directly onto Jonathan's pale, sweating face in the front row. "And true integrity cannot ever be bought." A massive, shocked ripple of gasps went through the elite crowd. Jonathan shifted violently, incredibly uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like his teeth might crack. Isabella confidently continued, her chosen words incredibly precise, highly deliberate, and cutting. "Many of you sitting in this room only know me simply as Isabella Colton. You know me as the quiet, pathetic wife who mysteriously disappeared from these glittering galas, the sad woman who was cruelly whispered about in the trashy tabloids for months. But I am absolutely not that weak woman anymore. I am Isabella Blackwell, a loyal daughter, a fierce, protective mother, and a proud woman who absolutely refuses to ever be silenced again." The entire room spontaneously erupted in thunderous applause. Jonathan's face burned a deep, humiliating, furious red. She calmly lifted a thick, heavy manila folder from the podium, holding it up high for the cameras. "Inside this specific folder," she said incredibly clearly, her voice rising over the noise, "is the absolute, undeniable hard evidence of exactly what happens when blinding, toxic arrogance tricks weak men into foolishly believing they are completely untouchable. It contains the proof of illicit affairs, massive corporate fraud, and millions of dollars in joint marital assets, illegally siphoned from a marriage simply to fund a cheap mistress's designer wardrobe. It contains illegal documents signed with highly careless, greedy hands." The silence in the room was deafening now. For many long, agonizing months, I was forced to quietly carry the massive, crushing shame of someone else's horrific betrayal. Tonight, I am officially returning that heavy shame to its absolute rightful owner. Loud gasps filled the massive room. Television cameras zoomed in tightly on the stage. Cassandra paled to a sickening shade of white, her bright, painted smile completely and utterly cracking in half. Jonathan, losing his mind, half rose aggressively from his chair, his voice breaking with sheer panic. "This is an absolute outrage. This is illegal slander. Sit the hell down." Jonathan, William Blackwell's deep, terrifying voice thundered across the room from the front row. The absolute, lethal command in. His tone silenced the younger man instantly, forcing him to drop back into his chair like a scolded child. Isabella's dark eyes never wavered from his face. This absolutely isn't slander, Jonathan. This is the absolute truth. And the truth is incredibly simple. You simply cannot build a massive corporate empire on a foundation of lies and realistically expect it to stand forever. My arrogant husband completely forgot that basic fact. He foolishly believed that his extreme wealth somehow magically excused his brutal betrayal. He believed that cheap mistresses could easily replace sacred marriage vows. He arrogantly believed that inflicting extreme public humiliation could successfully break my spirit forever. She smiled, a cold, victorious smile. He was entirely, catastrophically wrong. The massive crowd erupted once again, the roaring applause literally shaking the antique chandeliers above. Some people eagerly stood up, clapping loudly with genuine admiration for her bravery. Others leaned forward hungrily in their seats, deeply thrilled by the explosive, historic spectacle unfolding before them. Cassandra, looking completely desperate and terrified, aggressively grabbed Jonathan's arm. "Do something to stop her," she hissed frantically. But Jonathan remained completely frozen in his chair, his entire mask of arrogant control permanently shattered into a million unfixable pieces. Isabella absolutely wasn't finished yet. She leaned slightly closer to the microphone, her clear voice dropping to a beautifully calm, devastatingly soft, and highly emotional register. To absolutely every single woman out there in the world who has ever been cruelly betrayed by the man she loved, please hear my voice right now. You are absolutely not weak for trusting him. You are absolutely not invisible to the world. A man's betrayal absolutely does not define your worth or your future. It only reveals their own profound, pathetic weakness. And sometimes, the absolute best, most devastating revenge you can ever achieve is simply standing up, incredibly tall, while they violently crumble into dust at your feet. The powerful words struck the crowd exactly like a heavy hammer. The massive room literally roared with deafening applause, an ovation significantly louder and more passionate than anything Jonathan could have ever hoped to receive for an award. Excited reporters scrambled frantically over the velvet ropes, desperately capturing every single second on film. The major news story of the night was absolutely no longer about Jonathan's pathetic, desperate corporate comeback. It was entirely about Isabella's absolute, magnificent victory. Jonathan angrily rose to his feet, his voice violently trembling with unhinged rage. "You will deeply regret doing this to me, Isabella." But Isabella simply turned gracefully, her beautiful emerald gown sweeping dramatically behind her, and she met his furious eyes one final, victorious time. "No, Jonathan," she said calmly. "The absolute only person in this room who will ever regret anything is you. The bright, white spotlight followed her every move as she confidently descended the stage steps. Her father rose proudly to meet her at the bottom. An immense, blazing pride shining brightly in his icy blue eyes. The flashing cameras perfectly captured the historic, defining moment, the iconic image that would completely dominate global headlines for many weeks to come. Isabella Blackwell. Heavily pregnant and undeniably powerful, walking confidently away from the complete, fiery downfall of her abusive husband, with her head held incredibly high. Behind her, Jonathan slumped heavily back into his chair. The massive, crushing weight of total, public humiliation completely destroying him. Cassandra's shaking hand slipped quickly from his arm, her panicked eyes already darting toward the exit doors, ready to abandon him. The massive empire he had desperately tried to quickly rebuild that night completely, permanently, collapsed in the span of a single 5-minute speech. It wasn't destroyed with complex math or tricky corporate contracts, but entirely with the undeniable, raw truth spoken bravely by the very woman he arrogantly thought he had permanently destroyed. The chaotic gala eventually ended, but the massive, echoing shockwaves of Isabella's public revenge lingered heavily over the city long after the lights went out. Reporters enthusiastically ran her powerful quotes across global news networks. Thousands of women wrote her heartfelt letters of deep admiration. Wealthy investors who had once been highly loyal to Jonathan completely fled his company in droves, taking their millions straight to the Blackwell Group. And Jonathan, once the arrogant, untouchable king of Manhattan real estate, found himself permanently, completely dethroned and ruined by the very woman he had so foolishly, blindly underestimated. True, lasting revenge absolutely didn't need to utilize deadly poison or physical violence. It only ever needed a massive public stage, the undeniable truth, and a woman who was finally strong enough to boldly speak it. And Isabella had proudly spoken it for the entire world to hear. That specific night, Jonathan Colton's massive corporate empire officially died. But the magnificent, enduring legend of Isabella Blackwell was beautifully born. The quiet, busy weeks immediately following the explosive gala unfolded beautifully, reading exactly like a grand storybook written entirely by the hand of fate itself. For the disgraced Jonathan Colton, the massive financial and social downfall was incredibly swift and absolutely merciless. His massive real estate empire, once so deeply envied by his peers, began to violently crumble as terrified investors aggressively withdrew their funding and longtime corporate partners formally severed all legal ties. The mainstream media, absolutely relentless in its insatiable hunger for a juicy scandal, eagerly devoured every single humiliating detail of his complete collapse. Each new day brought fresh, devastating headlines: Colton Industries in massive financial crisis. Stock value plummets to record lows. Mistress Cassandra Monroe abruptly cuts ties amid scandal. Jonathan Colton faces federal investigation for gross financial misconduct. He had desperately, arrogantly wanted the bright spotlight, but now that he had, it burned him completely alive. Cassandra, the very woman he had once so proudly paraded around the city exactly like a shiny, new trophy, vanished into thin air almost overnight. Vicious. Rumors quickly swirled in the tabloids that she had hurriedly packed up the absolute last of Jonathan's expensive, stolen gifts, the massive diamonds, the designer handbags, and stacks of hard cash, and fled the country on a flight to Europe, completely without her glittering, distracting presence to hide behind. Jonathan physically looked significantly smaller, vastly weaker, exactly like a pathetic, deposed king who had been violently stripped of his stolen crown. Meanwhile, Isabella's incredible new life was rapidly transforming in beautiful ways she had once thought absolutely impossible. The very same trashy tabloids that had once cruelly mocked her absence now loudly hailed her as a modern feminist heroine. Thousands of women from all across the city, and eventually, the Globe, sent her heartfelt, emotional letters. Some were beautifully handwritten, some were lengthy emails, and some were direct messages on social media. They all deeply thanked her for bravely standing up in public, for clearly proving to the world that suffering deep betrayal didn't always have to end in silent, weeping defeat. You gave me the incredible courage I needed to finally leave my abuser, one woman tearfully wrote. Because of your bravery, I truly believe I can start my life over again. But Isabella absolutely wasn't vainly seeking out superficial fame or public adoration. She was far too busy aggressively building a beautiful, secure new future, not just for herself, but to ensure the total safety of her unborn child. With her incredibly powerful father's unwavering support and mentorship, she began actively taking on significantly more leadership responsibilities at the massive Blackwell Group. She wasn't just quietly attending the high-level board meetings anymore, she was confidently, brilliantly leading them. Her calm, yet incredibly firm voice carried massive weight in the room. Her sharp, highly strategic business decisions deeply impressed even the most cynical, seasoned corporate executives on the board. She had rapidly discovered a massive, hidden talent for corporate strategy, for empathetic leadership, and for effortlessly commanding deep respect without ever having to aggressively demand it. And slowly, beautifully, she realized something truly profound about her painful journey. Jonathan's horrific betrayal had absolutely not destroyed her life. It had simply, painfully redirected it onto a much better path. The beautiful nursery in the penthouse that had once been filled entirely with her bitter tears and dark despair was now overflowing with incredible hope and warm light. Isabella happily spent her quiet, peaceful evenings painting incredibly soft, beautiful murals directly onto the nursery walls, bright yellow stars, fluffy white clouds, and gentle, sleeping animals. She desperately wanted her sweet baby to wake up each and every morning completely surrounded by stunning beauty, by a constant, visual reminder that life was still incredibly good and still completely full of pure love. Her father often joined her in the nursery during the evenings, clumsily but lovingly assembling wooden baby furniture or reading aloud from complex business reports as she peacefully painted. They laughed loudly together. They sometimes cried softly together over the memory of her mother. But through absolutely all of the pain, they grew significantly closer than they ever had been before. For the great William Blackwell, successfully protecting and empowering his daughter had easily become his life's absolute greatest, most cherished achievement. And for Isabella, finally discovering her own massive inner strength had become her ultimate, greatest gift. Jonathan desperately tried to fight back in the courts. Of course, he frantically filed endless legal appeals, aggressively demanded ridiculous financial settlements, and pathetically attempted to salvage his ruined name in the press. But absolutely every single pathetic effort fell completely flat. The secret prenup clause was completely ironclad. The massive mountain of hard evidence proving his extreme financial misconduct was entirely overwhelming to the judge. The stern judge swiftly and decisively granted Isabella absolute, full parental custody of the child, 100% controlling interest in all their joint financial assets, and total, permanent freedom from the toxic man who had caused her so much agonizing pain. On the bright, sunny day, the messy divorce was finally legally finalized. Isabella walked proudly out of the massive courthouse doors with her father standing firmly at her side. The paparazzi cameras flashed wildly, shouting. Reporters aggressively yelled questions over the barricades. But she didn't stop her stride to answer them. She only smiled a bright, genuine smile, her warm hand resting highly protectively on her prominent belly, her dark eyes shining brilliantly with absolute, quiet triumph. Isabella, do you have absolutely any final, parting words today for Jonathan? One desperate reporter called out loudly over the noise. She paused gracefully at the very bottom of the stone courthouse steps, her beautiful emerald green coat fluttering gently in the crisp winter breeze. She turned her body just enough for the hundreds of cameras to perfectly capture her stunning expression. She looked entirely calm, deeply serene, and completely unshakable. Yes, she said softly, but clearly enough to be heard. I sincerely wish him well. May he finally truly learn what true success in life actually means. The massive crowd erupted with loud cheers of admiration. The powerful, dignified message was incredibly clear to the world. She absolutely didn't need to seek bitter vengeance against him anymore. She had already completely won the va. Months later, on a beautifully warm, bright spring morning entirely filled with golden sunlight, Isabella successfully gave birth to a perfectly healthy, screaming baby boy. The private hospital room was instantly filled with joyous Laughter and happy, relieved tears as the great William Blackwell gently held his tiny grandson for the very first time. His large, rough, calloused hands, trembling visibly with profound tenderness. Isabella gazed down lovingly at her beautiful sleeping child, her healed heart completely overflowing with an emotion so powerful it stole her breath. "Welcome to the world, my sweet little one," she whispered softly, kissing his warm forehead. "You are my ultimate strength, my absolute reason, my everything." She proudly named the boy Alexander, specifically after her late mother's father, a good man who had been widely known and deeply respected for his unwavering honor and integrity. Life after surviving Jonathan certainly wasn't always easy. There were many exhausting nights of sleeplessness, brief, fleeting moments of lingering self-doubt, and massive corporate challenges that heavily tested her patience. But absolutely every single time she looked deeply into baby Alexander's bright eyes, she vividly remembered exactly why she had fought so fiercely, why she had bravely risen from the ashes, and exactly why she had ultimately survived the flames. Her highly public, philanthropic role grew massively, too. She quickly became a fierce, highly respected global advocate for vulnerable women, regularly speaking at massive international conferences and actively launching well-funded foundations that specifically supported mothers who had been cruelly abandoned and financially abused by their partners. She effectively used her massive global platform not to seek petty personal revenge against Jonathan, but purely for the ultimate empowerment of others. One beautiful evening, standing confidently on a brightly lit stage at a massive global women's empowerment summit, Isabella openly shared the raw, unedited story of her survival. The massive, packed audience listened in absolute, pin-drop silence, some women quietly wiping away hot tears, others nodding deeply in painful recognition of her struggles. I truly, honestly thought that enduring such a massive, public betrayal was going to be the tragic end of my life story, she told the hushed crowd, her voice strong and echoing. But I was wrong. It was absolutely only the very beginning. I thought that toxic love had completely broken me into pieces. But it actually completely rebuilt me. And if there is absolutely one profound thing I've learned through all this pain, it is this: a woman's true inner strength is absolutely not measured by exactly how much terrible pain she can silently endure in the dark. It is entirely measured by exactly how fiercely she chooses to rise up into the light after the pain has stopped. And I promise you, we can all rise. The massive crowd immediately stood up in a roaring, tearful, standing ovation. Isabella simply bowed her head, not in arrogance or pride, but in pure, overwhelming gratitude. Back at her peaceful home later that night, as she gently rocked baby Alexander to sleep in the nursery, Isabella often thought deeply about the incredible, chaotic journey, the crushing public humiliation, the total emotional collapse, The tense courtroom battles, the explosive gala, and the ultimate, beautiful triumph. Every single agonizing moment had perfectly, necessarily shaped her into the powerful woman she was right now. She absolutely didn't hate Jonathan anymore. She honestly didn't even bother to think about the existence of Cassandra. Their toxic names were absolutely nothing more than fading dark shadows in an old storybook that simply no longer belonged to her. This beautiful life was her story now. She was Isabella Blackwell, a devoted mother, a brilliant corporate leader, a fierce survivor, and an unstoppable storm. And as she gently whispered a sweet good night to her sleeping son, she intimately knew the absolute, unshakable truth that would carry her safely for the rest of her life. She was never, ever truly broken. She was only being magnificently remade. So, my dear, wonderful friends, this incredible, emotional story has now finally come to an end. And if you are actually still sitting right here with me at this very moment, listening to these final words, it means that something deep inside this powerful journey has profoundly touched your heart in a way you maybe didn't expect when you started. Perhaps her story, painful, reminded you of your own difficult, hidden struggles, or your own silent, agonizing heartbreak. Or maybe it simply whispered a profound truth to your soul that you already deeply knew, that absolutely no betrayal, no massive loss, and no deep wound has the ultimate power to define who you are forever. Life will absolutely test us all, sometimes incredibly, unfairly, cruelly. The very people we love and trust the most may brutally betray us. Sacred promises may break into pieces, and the beautiful future we firmly thought was absolutely certain may violently collapse in a single instant. But as the great Stoic philosopher Epictetus once so wisely said, it's not what happens to you, but exactly how you choose to react to it that matters. Isabella's incredible story is absolutely not just a sad tale about enduring pain. It is entirely a story about bravely rising up. It is about finally discovering the massive, burning fire that was absolutely always hiding inside her, buried deep beneath the gray ashes. And maybe, tonight as you watch this, you finally realize that the exact same unstoppable fire lives brightly in you. 2. The brilliant Marcus Aurelius once wrote, you have absolute power over your own mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find true strength. That is what true, profound healing actually is. It is absolutely not about magically erasing your deep scars, but entirely about wearing those scars with immense dignity, as absolute proof to the world that you survived the worst and became infinitely stronger because of it. So, please take the powerful lesson of this story with you today. Do not view it as just another piece of internet drama, but as a vital, daily reminder, no matter who cowardly walks away from you, no matter how completely broken things currently seem in your life, you are absolutely never, ever powerless. You can always rebuild your life. You can always rise from the ashes. And sometimes, the terrifying ending you feared so much is absolutely only the beautiful new beginning you so desperately needed. If this emotional, triumphant story has moved your heart today, I would absolutely love for you to hit that like button on this video. Please, share it with someone in your life who really needs to find their inner strength today. And make sure you subscribe to our channel so you'll never, ever miss another incredible journey like this one. Because together, as a strong, supportive community, we can constantly remind each other that pain is absolutely not the end of the story. Sometimes, it is simply the open doorway to finally becoming exactly who we were always meant to be. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.